The wind howled through the bare branches of the oak tree in Peter's backyard, sending a flurry of red and gold leaves spiraling into the air. He watched them dance across the lawn, a gust of autumn sweeping them away before they could land. It was a crisp October afternoon, and Peter was intent on finishing his chore. The neighborhood was dotted with the same seasonal scene: leaves piled high against fences, lawns that would need to be raked again tomorrow, and the smell of fireplaces beginning to billow smoke into the cold air. He reached for his rake again, the handle feeling smooth against his palms, and thought about how little he liked doing this task. It wasn't the work itself, it was the absence of anything exciting to fill the gap between school and dinner. The endless routine of it all. But today his eyes lingered on his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Haynes, who stood on her porch, wrapped in a shawl, watching him. Peter paused mid-rake, wiping his brow. Mrs. Haynes was one of those quiet figures in the neighborhood that no one really thought about unless they had to. She had lived there for decades, and her husband, Robert, had passed away a few years ago. He had been a carpenter, Peter had heard. They had no children, and no family visited anymore. She was just there. Something about the way she looked at him almost expectantly made Peter feel a little guilty. He could have continued raking, could have ignored her, but something inside him stirred. Maybe it was the loneliness in her eyes, or the way she always sat in that rocking chair on her porch, as though waiting for something to happen. Peter made a decision. He walked over, dragging the rake behind him. "Hey, Mrs. Haynes," he called, waving his hand. "I can finish your leaves for you." Her eyes widened, a flicker of surprise softening the wrinkles around her eyes. "Oh, Peter, you don't have to do that. Really, it's quite all right." "No, really," he insisted, a bit shy now that the offer was out there. "I don't mind." She smiled, a faint, grateful curve of her lips. "Well then, if you're sure, I'd be happy for the help." Peter set to work immediately, his hands working steadily. Mrs. Haynes didn't move, but her presence lingered in the cool air. He couldn't help but notice how she seemed to have this quiet grace about her, even in her old age. He had heard snippets of her life from the other neighbors about how she and Robert had traveled together, about the way he had built their house from the ground up. But there was a depth to her silence, something unspoken, that intrigued Peter more than any rumor. After a few minutes, Peter paused, standing straight and stretching his back. "Done," he said, though there was still a pile of leaves in the far corner of her yard. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. Mrs. Haynes smiled softly. "Well, you certainly worked quickly. Thank you, Peter." Peter scratched the back of his head. It was nothing, really. She glanced at the wicker chairs on her porch. "Would you like to come inside for tea? I've made a fresh pot." Peter hesitated. His mom always told him to be polite, but it wasn't often that anyone invited him into their home, especially not someone as old and quiet as Mrs. Haynes. "Sure," Peter finally said, nodding his head. "That sounds nice." Mrs. Haynes led him into the warmth of her home. The place smelled like old wood and lavender. There were bookshelves lining the walls, and photographs in frames covered the tables. It was a house filled with stories, though the walls seemed to hold them tightly. They sat at her small kitchen table, sipping the tea as she asked him about school. It was easy to talk to her, easier than he'd expected, and as the steam from the cups drifted into the air, Peter felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the tea. There was something about Mrs. Haynes, something steady and kind, that made him feel like he belonged in this little moment. As the afternoon waned, Mrs. Haynes spoke of her late husband, Robert, and their time together. Her words were gentle, laced with a quiet nostalgia, but there was a weight to them too, a longing for days that could never return. "I miss him," she said, her voice soft. "We didn't have much, but we had each other." Peter listened intently, knowing that this wasn't just about her husband. It was about the whole life she had lived, one that he couldn't quite understand but felt he was beginning to touch, if only for a moment. By the time he left, the sun was dipping behind the horizon. Mrs. Haynes stood at the door, waving him off. "Thank you, Peter. I'll see you soon, won't I?" she asked. Peter nodded. "Sure, Mrs. Haynes. I'll come back and rake your leaves again sometime." He walked home with a strange feeling of fulfillment. It wasn't just the raking, but the simple connection they had made. In a world that often felt busy and chaotic, this small exchange seemed like something valuable, something he wouldn't forget. Over the next few weeks, Peter found himself spending more and more time with Mrs. Haynes. After school, he'd make his way to her house, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the golden leaves crunching beneath his feet. Mrs. Haynes seemed to look forward to his visits. He would help with small chores, carrying groceries, sweeping her porch, or simply sitting with her while she worked on her puzzles. One afternoon, just before Thanksgiving, Peter noticed that her house, usually so inviting, seemed empty. The windows were dark, and the air around the porch had a stillness to it. Mrs. Haynes hadn't come out to greet him. Her usual chair sat empty, the leaves in her yard still untouched. Peter knocked on the door, but when no one answered, he took the liberty of walking around to the back. There, through the kitchen window, he saw her, sitting at the table, her face hidden in her hands. Concerned, Peter knocked louder this time. "Mrs. Haynes, are you okay?" The door opened slowly, and she appeared, her eyes red, as if she had been crying. "Oh, Peter," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't mean to worry you. I just..." Peter stepped inside, his concern growing. "What's wrong? What happened?" She wiped her eyes quickly and smiled faintly, though the sadness was clear. "It's nothing really. Just memories, that's all." Peter sat down beside her, feeling the weight of her sorrow in the air. "Do you want to talk about it?" She took a long, slow breath. "It's just that I never got to decorate for Christmas after Robert passed. He always handled that, and now it just feels so empty without him." Peter's heart ached for her. He thought about how much he looked forward to Christmas, the lights, the tree, the whole festive atmosphere that filled their home with joy. Mrs. Haynes was right, it must be terribly lonely, without those traditions, without Robert to share them. I could help you," Peter said after a long pause, his voice quiet but determined. Mrs. Haynes looked at him, her eyes softening. "You would? But Peter, you have your own family to think about. You don't have to." "I want to," Peter said firmly. "I'll help you decorate. It'll be fun." A smile, almost shy, spread across Mrs. Haynes's face. "Well, if you insist." And so, they spent the rest of the afternoon hanging garlands, setting up a small tree by the window, and placing little ornaments around the house. Peter even found a box of old decorations, handmade ones that Robert had crafted, and carefully placed them on the branches. By the time they were done, the house didn't feel quite so empty anymore. It was filled with the warmth of the little things they had created together, memories of a life shared, and the beginning of new ones between them. As Peter stood back, admiring their work, Mrs. Haynes turned to him with a gentle look of gratitude. "Thank you, Peter. I don't know what I would have done without you." Peter grinned. "Anytime, Mrs. Haynes." Christmas arrived, and the house was alive with the scent of roasted turkey and the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth. Peter had been eagerly awaiting this moment, the day when Mrs. Haynes would join his family for dinner. His parents had been more than happy to extend the invitation, though Peter wasn't sure how she would feel about it. It had been a long time since she'd spent Christmas with anyone other than Robert. But when she arrived, carefully dressed in a soft green sweater and a pair of slacks, Peter could see the joy in her eyes. She was nervous, yes, but there was also a sparkle there, a sign that, despite her years of solitude, this day meant something to her. As the evening unfolded, Mrs. Haynes blended seamlessly into their small gathering. She chatted with Peter's parents, sharing stories of the past of Robert, of travels they had taken, of the home they had built together. Peter's mom, who had always been the life of the party, laughed at Mrs. Haynes's witty remarks. His dad, typically reserved, seemed at ease, listening intently to her stories about the old neighborhood. Peter watched the exchange, a smile tugging at his lips. This was exactly what Mrs. Haynes had needed, a reminder that she wasn't invisible, that her memories mattered, that she had a place in this world. As dinner drew to a close, Mrs. Haynes turned to Peter, who had been sitting beside her, his plate empty for a while. "I hope you don't mind, Peter," she began softly, "but I have something for you." She reached into her bag and pulled out a neatly wrapped package. It was small but clearly handmade, the corners of the fabric folded with care. Peter blinked in surprise. "For me? But I didn't get you anything." Mrs. Haynes smiled, a flicker of nostalgia in her eyes. "You've already given me the best gift. But this," she handed him the package. Peter slowly unwrapped it, his hands trembling slightly as he revealed a handmade scarf. It was knitted from soft wool in shades of deep blue and green, the kind of scarf that would keep anyone warm on the coldest of days. "I made this for you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It's a reminder that no matter where you go or how far you travel, you'll always have something of mine with you." Peter held the scarf in his hands, his heart swelling with gratitude. He wrapped it around his neck immediately, feeling its warmth. It wasn't just the fabric that comforted him, but the thought behind it, the time Mrs. Haynes had spent, the love woven into every stitch. "Thank you," he whispered, the words carrying more meaning than he could express. The winter passed quickly, but it was a bitter one for Mrs. Haynes. Her health had been declining for some time, and Peter noticed it more with each visit. She seemed frailer, her movements slower, her energy less vibrant. She no longer sat on the porch rocking chair, and her visits to the kitchen for tea became less frequent. Peter helped as much as he could, keeping her company, bringing over soup, and even reading to her when she felt too tired to do much else. One chilly February afternoon, Peter arrived to find her lying on the couch, a blanket pulled over her. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow. He felt a pang of dread in his chest. "Mrs. Haynes?" Peter called softly. "Are you all right?" She opened her eyes and smiled weakly. "I'm just tired, Peter. I'm afraid I won't be around much longer." Peter's throat tightened. He sat next to her, grasping her hand. "Don't say that. You're going to be okay. You're strong." She laughed softly, a sound full of warmth despite the frailty in her voice. "Oh, I've had a good life, Peter. I've loved deeply, and I've known kindness, especially from you." Peter shook his head, his eyes filling with tears. "I don't want you to go." Her fingers tightened around his. "I'm not really going, dear. I'll always be here, in your heart, in your memories. You've made sure of that." For the first time in weeks, Mrs. Haynes was at peace, her eyes closing gently, as if she were slipping into a peaceful slumber. Peter stayed by her side, holding her hand, never wanting to let go. That evening, Peter went home, his heart heavy with the loss. He missed her already, but he also carried a sense of peace, knowing that Mrs. Haynes had found some comfort, some joy in these last months of her life. She had been part of his world, and he part of hers. A few days after her passing, Peter received a letter in the mail, addressed to him in Mrs. Haynes's unmistakable handwriting. He opened it slowly, already knowing that it would be the last thing she would ever say to him. Inside, there was a note and a typewriter. The letter read, "Dear Peter, I am leaving you this typewriter and these stories. Write about the things that matter. Write about the love we share. And write about me if you feel it in your heart. Remember, the greatest gift we can give each other is the stories we leave behind. With all my love, Mrs. Haynes." Peter sat in his room, the typewriter before him, the letter still in his hand. He couldn't hold back the tears, but they were different now. They weren't just tears of sadness. They were tears of gratitude for the friendship he had found, for the memories he would carry with him, for the love that had filled their time together. And so, Peter began to write. He wrote about Mrs. Haynes's life, about the love she had for Robert, about the way she had touched his life. Slowly, methodically, he began to craft the story of a woman who had lived a full, meaningful life, one that would never be forgotten. By sharing her memories, Peter realized that Mrs. Haynes was still with him. Her stories would live on, passed from one person to another, growing ever more vibrant, like the leaves that had fallen in autumn. And with that, he understood the greatest gift is not the things we have, but the love and kindness we leave behind. It is the stories, the moments shared, the people we touch, that shape our legacy. And that legacy, Peter knew, would always be with him. So if you love the story, be sure to subscribe, hit the bell, and comment below. Your interaction helps us grow.